Okay, hello everyone. Today we'll be talking about day 2 of Egyptian geography, and by the end of the lesson you will be able to identify the importance of the floods on farming and the role of the Nile River and the role that the Nile River played on early Egyptian society. So, the floods of the Nile. This is day 2, so we already know the direction of the Nile, that it flows north. So, the flooding, as we talked about in yesterday's lesson, it's the entire reason why farming was possible, why there was agriculture, and why there was even any civilization capable of existing in ancient Egypt, or even really in Egypt today. So the Egyptian farmers always welcomed these floods and the mud that it brought with it. That mud was the actual silt, and you guys know what that is based on our previous few weeks of lessons. So they welcomed these floods. Otherwise, they wouldn't have their fresh water for irrigation, and they wouldn't have land that had silt and fertilizer on it already. And that mud that came from the bottom of the bottom of the river, the Nile River bed, it's black soil, and black is a good thing. It means high, very high in nutrients. The darker the soil, the better. Brown and yellow and sand color. It's just, there's no nutrients in it. So the black soil of the silt contrasted, really shows up against the yellow sand of Egypt's deserts. And you can't grow anything in deserts in the yellow sand. There's no nutrients and there's no moisture there. The farmers of Egypt depended on the right amount of flooding each year. They didn't get to order it and have it delivered to them. They just had to hope that the floods happened at the right time and that they got the right amount of water in those floods. And there was definitely a sweet spot. Too little of water in the floods, too little of a flood meant the crops didn't grow. They didn't have the fertilizing silt. It didn't have this black soil, it didn't have the mud, and it wouldn't have the water for irrigation. And then too much of it caused destruction for cattle. It would drown cattle and sweep them away. It could flood the homes and destroy them. Water is an absolutely devastating force. Now, to illustrate this for you, this is a satellite image of Egypt. And I just want to point out that this is Lower Egypt because the water flows north this way towards the Mediterranean Sea that I'm outlining right up here. You can even see how it's shallower water right here. Okay, so this is the river delta of the Nile, and you can see how green and lush it is, and how on both sides of the Nile River, which is what I'm tracing right here, it's green, and other than that, it's largely dead. Okay, it's desert, guys. And that's pretty dramatic. If you go a little closer and take an aerial shot of that instead of from space, this is the Nile River today. You see the snaking body of water. You can see the farms on both sides. These are all these little checkered looking things here. This is all green farm fields. And you can see how far that irrigation, those floods go, because this is the line. And you can literally stand with 1 foot here on green farmland and 1 foot on desert. That is how dramatic it is. Okay? So, drought and flood. Okay? A drought is a long period of dry weather, or a long period of not enough moisture, rain, that leads to a water shortage. A drought is a water shortage, but it's not like, well, it didn't rain for, 4 days, so we're in a drought. No, this summer we had a drought. It didn't really rain for several months. And that was a drought, and now we're getting all that rain back. That's why it's been pretty wet lately. So the Nile was the main way that people would also move. Movement on the Nile River is really important. That's why when we examine today the role of the Nile River on Egyptian society, it was the basis of all society. Everything revolved around that Nile River. So it's not just that we're talking about the floods of the Nile and how it helped with farming and a food surplus more than you need. Yes, farming is a big part of why the Nile's there. Also for a fresh water source to drink. Humans always have to have water. But the interesting thing is that the Nile River also impacted society because this is their transportation. This is like the Nile is a highway. Okay, it's a waterway highway. So the Nile was the main way that people would move goods, trade goods between villages and up and down that Nile River. If you look here, you would have villages, and then later on cities and towns up and down on both sides of the Nile River. And you could walk it on foot, or you can use the superhighway, which was the river itself. And so the 600-mile journey to trade from Upper to Lower Egypt would take over a month to walk on foot, or just about 2 weeks in a reed boat made by reeds that are on the banks, the shore of the Nile River. So that's a lot more efficient. So walking is not as efficient. Using the river as a superhighway of transportation, and even today it's a superhighway of transportation for Egypt. So when we talk about drought, a long period of dry weather, if it's a severe drought and it lasts for years, this is a dry riverbed, not necessarily one in Egypt with the Nile, but it's definitely in Africa. This is what will happen to that riverbed. It will dry so severely that it cracks and looks like this, okay? And that's a severe drought, and that can have a devastating impact on society and on a group of people that are living there that are depending on a freshwater source. So to wrap things up here, the main idea of the last two lessons, especially today, is that early farming communities of ancient Egypt centered around the Nile. It was the function of everyday life. The Nile River provided these very important things: the fertile soil, the silt, the water for irrigation, and a means of transportation, of travel. Human movement in the ancient world didn't happen a whole lot. This is a big reason why it was possible in Egypt. And to look at that map, if you're traveling the 600 miles down the Nile River, which goes a lot further down here off the map, the ability to have a lower Egypt and in the south and upper Egypt, the common denominator there for math is Egypt. There's an upper and a lower, and eventually they become unified because of this water superhighway. If they were too far apart, you wouldn't be able to travel, and Egyptians would have been no upper and lower Egypt. It really would have been one kingdom of one civilization and an entirely different civilization in the south. The Nile River keeps life flowing, literally, but also it provides them with life, but also the transportation to stay as one country, as one kingdom. Okay? And so the importance of the gift of the Nile that we covered yesterday. So the Nile is the world's longest river. It says more than 4,000 miles. It's 4,123 miles long. The farmers' understanding of the yearly Nile floods made community life in Egypt possible. That's why they had settlements, or else no ancient humans would have settled in Egypt. And they would have just kept moving, or they wouldn't have even traveled through Egypt, because it would have been inhospitable without that freshwater source. It is truly the gift of the Nile. It provides life, and that's why civilization is there. The mineral-rich silt deposits and irrigation technology that developed made farming in ancient Egypt very productive, and that irrigation technology is man-made canals. You would just take a bunch of people, either slaves or peasants, and have them digging out canals. That transfers the water from one location to another. We talked about this in ancient Mesopotamia in our last unit. But if you're looking here, the water of the Nile will flood both sides of the river's banks this much, and then it recedes back. But that's only once a year. This has to stay wet if you're farming during your entire growing season. And so they're really hard to see. You can't really see them from this sky view here, but canals are those man-made waterways that will deposit the water into a place where there is none, and that's how, think of it like a sprinkler system today for grass or for a garden. And then, of course, transportation is people use boats to get from place to place along the Nile River.